Imagine with me, if you will, that we are first century Jews, and we're standing along this road that leads to the capital city of Jerusalem that's behind us. And the crowds have kind of been growing over the last couple of days as we prepare for the holiday season that's coming up, and rumor begins to spread that Jesus of Nazareth is on his way. He's coming here, he's coming to the capital city. And this is a big deal, because with Jesus come all of these extra rumors, all of these things that he's done, these things that he's said, the way that he's reinterpreting scripture, these miracles that are just mind-blowing. And as we're standing here and we're kind of anticipating, we're waiting, we're looking over the horizon, waiting for Jesus to come, the thing that's probably running around in our head are these different roles that Jesus could possibly be playing, possibly fulfill. This role of prophet, this role of high priest. But for me and you right now, the number one thing in our mind, the thing that we want more than anything for Jesus to become, is king. King of Israel. King of Israel, to be able to kick out these foreign oppressors, these Romans, to get them out of here, to set up this free nation once again where we can worship. We don't have to pay taxes to this pagan Caesar who worships all of these gods, and we could be Jews once again like it was originally intended to be. And so as Jesus is approaching, all of these things are running around in our heads. But I want to focus tonight on this very specific time period that I think would be the most prominent idea, the most prominent thought in the head of a first century Jew watching and anticipating Jesus as he arrives in Jerusalem. And that has to do with this time period between the Old Testament and the New Testament, when a new king arose. A king that we don't find in the Bibles that we read. If you got a Bible in front of you, you won't see this man's name. But he was incredibly important, especially during the first century. I want to tell you about him. But first, I want to give you an idea of just how long and how crazy complicated the Jews' history with a king really is. This happened 1,000 years ago when King David, who when we think of kings, when it comes to Israel, is the number one guy that probably comes to your mind. Maybe Solomon? But the people of Israel really, really wanted a king when they came out of Egypt, and they were begging God, we want a king just like all of the other countries around us. And God said, hey, listen, you really don't. That's my job. My job is to take care of you. My job is to fulfill the role of king, unlike all of these other countries around here. But the people would not let this go. And so God said, all right, you have to understand what this is going to mean. It's going to mean taxation. It's going to mean your children are going to get conscripted to go fight in these foreign wars. And they said, we don't care. We want a king. So God said, all right, you can have a king. And that's when it started. This royal line, this royal family, and all of the drama that would entail. Right up until the point where David has a son, Solomon, who takes over, and he's incredibly brilliant. But things don't go very well, do they? When Solomon passes, his sons end up splitting the kingdom in two, and then the Assyrians come in and they take over, and then the Babylonians come in and they take over, and then the Persians come in and they take over. Thankfully, the Persians allow the people to go back, to rebuild the temple, to restart worshiping God as they had done so long ago. But about that time, this new conqueror shows up on the world stage, this young guy known as Alexander the Great. And he starts conquering kingdom after kingdom after kingdom. And he ends up wiping out the Persians. And when he hits about 33 years old, he starts getting sick, and he knows he's about to die. And so what he does is he splits up this massive kingdom that he's conquered. He splits it up between all of his generals. And those generals do what generals usually do. They battle it out as soon as Alexander is gone. And the one that rises to the top creates this new Seleucid empire. And it's massive, it's huge. And after a couple of those kings pass away and you get a little bit further down the line, about 160 BC, about 160-ish years before Jesus is born, the king at that time goes down to advance his kingdom, to expand it even further, and he goes to attack Egypt. And he ends up getting completely humiliated. And that's where the book of First Maccabees kicks in. Now, if you're like most Christians, you probably haven't heard of the book First Maccabees, let alone the book of Second Maccabees, and you probably haven't read them either. But they are incredibly important because they tell the story of what happens between the end of our Old Testament, the end of the prophets, and that 400-year gap until Matthew picks up his pen and begins to write the story of Jesus of Nazareth. In that 400 years, even though we don't have any record of it in our scripture, believe it or not, time doesn't stand still. There's still stuff going on. Kingdoms rise and fall. Kings come to power and are assassinated. There's all kinds of drama. It's really, really fascinating. But the thing that we're concerned about tonight begins in the book of First Maccabees. I'm going to read that a bit to you, but here's why this is so important. It's important because this is what would be fresh on the minds, not hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years past in the history of Israel, but this would be just about within living memory of what's being taken place right now as we wait for Jesus to walk into the capital city. So, what happens is Alexander the Great dies, Seleucid Empire rises up, takes over all of the known world. Egypt stands against them, and the king of the Seleucid Empire at that time, known as Antiochus, goes down and ends up getting totally humiliated. And he has to take his army and head all the way back home to Syria. And on his way back home, in his frustration, in his anger, he stops by Jerusalem and takes out all of his rage on the Jewish people. He slaughters thousands of them and begins to put in all of these demands of the Jewish people that would just drive them absolutely insane. He outlawed the Sabbath. You had to work on the Sabbath, which was unacceptable to the Jews. They weren't allowed to celebrate any of their feasts, any of their festivals. He outlawed circumcision, and any mother who was found to have circumcised her son was to be slaughtered along with her child, the rest of her family, and the person who performed the circumcision. This guy was just absolutely brutal. He ransacked the temple in Jerusalem, took all of the gold and all of the things that were needed for sacrifices, and then, to top it all off, he makes a sacrifice of a pig on the altar to Zeus. And he demands that all of the Jews had to now call Yahweh Zeus Olympus. They had to perform these pagan sacrifices. And there were two major responses to what was going on when Antiochus came in and made all these demands. There was this group of people that decided, you know what, it's not worth the fight. We're going to get absolutely slaughtered if we try to rebel. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to assimilate. We're just going to kind of cower back. We're going to decide, you know what, let's not rock the boat, and we'll slowly adjust to this new culture. It was painful for them, but it was worth the cost to save the lives of their friends, of their family, and their fellow countrymen. These people were the very beginnings of this group that would later be known as the Sadducees. These people who became Hellenistic, no longer really worshiping and practicing in the traditional Jewish fashion. There's another response, though, a response that's frankly exactly the opposite. Their response wasn't to roll over. It wasn't to comply with all of these demands that Antiochus was making. Their response was to rise up, was to rebel, was to fight for their freedom, to fight for the honor of God and for their Jewish heritage. They weren't about to bow down to some foreign pagan leader who was requiring them to make pagan sacrifices. It was unacceptable. This group was the very beginnings of what would later be known as the Pharisees. So as you read through the New Testament and you see Jesus interacting with the Sadducees and the Pharisees, this is where those two people kind of began. This group of Jews split off, and they have totally different worldviews by the time we find them in the New Testament. But for the moment, this incredible man, known as Mattathias, is approached by one of the officials of the king, and he's demanding that Mattathias make a pagan offering to Zeus. And that's where we pick it up in the book of 1 Maccabees. I'm going to be reading to you for probably the very first time of any of my sermons out of these two books. I haven't done it before. You've probably never heard a sermon preached out of the Maccabees, but it's first time for everything because, it's just weird days. So I'm going to be starting in chapter 2 of 1 Maccabees. I want to tell you the story of this guy and his sons and what that meant for the people of Israel. So here we go. I'm going to start in verse 15. Then the king's officials, who were forcing the people to turn from God, came down to the town of Modin to force the people there to offer pagan sacrifices. Many of the Israelites came to meet them, including Mattathias and his sons. The king's officials said to Mattathias, "You're a respected leader in this town, and you have the support of your sons and your relatives. Why not be the first one here to do what the king has commanded? All the Gentiles, all the people of Judea, and all the people left in Jerusalem, they've already done so. If you do, you and your sons will be honored with the title of friends of the king, and you'll be rewarded with silver and gold and many gifts." Mattathias answered in a loud voice for all of the people that were surrounding them to hear. He didn't want anyone to be mistaken at what his response was to this demand by the official. "I don't care if every Gentile in this empire has obeyed the king and yielded to the command to abandon the religion of his ancestors. My children, my relatives, and I will continue to keep the covenant that God made with our ancestors. With God's help, we will never abandon his law or disobey his commands. We'll not obey the king's decree, and we will not change our way of worship in the least." And just as he finished speaking, right, Mattathias gives this big rousing speech, we're never going to do that. Just as he finished speaking, one of the men from Modin decided to obey the king's decree and stepped out in front of everyone to offer a pagan sacrifice on the altar that stood there. When Mattathias saw him, he became angry enough to do what had to be done. Shaking with rage, he ran forward and killed the man right there on the altar. Brutal. He also killed the royal official who was forcing the people to sacrifice, and then he tore down the altar. In this way, Mattathias showed his deep devotion for the law, just as Phinehas had done when he killed Zimri, son of Salu. I'm going to skip down to verse 42. Then Mattathias and his friends were joined by a group of devout and patriotic Jews, the strongest and bravest men in Israel, who had all volunteered to defend the law. In addition, everyone who was fleeing from the persecution joined them and strengthened their forces. Now that they had an army, they gave vent to their anger by attacking the renegade Jews. Those who escaped were forced to flee to the Gentiles for safety. Mattathias and his friends went everywhere, tearing down pagan altars and circumcising by force every uncircumcised boy they found within the borders of Israel. They were also successful in hunting down the arrogant Gentile officials. They rescued the law of Moses from the Gentiles and their kings, and broke the power of the wicked king Antiochus. For the Jews in the first century, this was the ultimate hero. Not only was he a patriot for his country and his countrymen, but he was also a righteous man of God who refused to bow down to these pagan gods and these foreign leaders. He was willing to do what had to be done. He was willing to kill the enemies of Yahweh. Somebody who rose up with military power and went to war. in the name of God. He helped to establish this free nation that once again had power, had freedom, and had wealth. Stories of Mattathias were the ones that were told at night to the little boys and the little girls. That's the kind of guy we're waiting for once again. One day God's going to send us another Mattathias, right? But the coolest stories weren't necessarily about Mattathias, they were actually about his sons, particularly his son Judas, who, because of his incredible strength and brutality in battle, and probably the weapon that he chose to use as well, was known as Judas the Hammer, or in Hebrew, Judas Maccabee. Judas was this really, really passionate guy. He rallied the troops, he rallied the men of Israel, and they would go and they would fight this guerrilla war. They eventually got to the point where they were able to take back the capital city of Jerusalem. And that's when they began the process of ritually cleaning the temple and rededicating it to God. And those moments are actually what's celebrated by Jews today in the celebration known as Hanukkah. This is what Hanukkah is all about, the rededication of the temple so that the Jewish people could once again worship. Pretty impressive, right? Well, as it so happens, Judas the Hammer ends up dying in another valiant battle. His brothers bring him back, they bury him, and then his two brothers, Jonathan and Simon, kind of take over this whole rebellion thing. And over the next couple of years, in this massive, brutal, savage guerrilla warfare, they end up winning their freedom. They end up creating this brand new kingdom of Israel. And it's free, once again, for the first time in a long, long time. And Simon ends up becoming king. But not just king, also taking on the role of high priest. These two things traditionally were never allowed to be held by the exact same person, but Simon decided that he was the guy and this was the time. And so he did. He became king and high priest. And over the next 100 years, the people of Israel had their freedom. They had the ability to worship. They had wealth. They had their own country again. But then, because of politics and everything that you could probably imagine was going on, there begins this civil war that breaks out. These two different groups who look at the world very, very differently end up having this massive civil war, and they both go to this new young country asking for help. Will you come and will you take out our enemies? And if you do, we'll sign a treaty with you and we will be your vassals as long as you allow us to continue to worship on our own. If we have freedom in our worship, we will let you come in and kind of rule us. That young country is Rome. And so in about 60 BC, 60 years before Jesus is born, Rome comes in and the general Pompey takes out their enemies, and you end up in this brand new world where Rome has taken over Israel. The Israelites are allowed to worship, they're allowed to do their stuff, but they have to pay tribute to Caesar. And they're kind of ruled. Once again, they've lost this kingdom, they've lost their freedom. It's kind of sad, right? But these are the stories that the people would be thinking of as Jesus rolls in, right? Not these ancient prophecies from 1,000 years ago. Not these old kings that are so far in the past that nobody really knows what they were like. We've got ideas, we've got the stories that were passed down, but we're talking right now 60 years. That's not very long. To put it into a modern day perspective, this is the difference between the very first kings of England in 1000 AD, who frankly I can't remember the names, even though I just looked them up this morning. Those guys versus FDR. Kind of know FDR, right? That's not that long ago, especially compared to the first kings of England in 1000 AD. That's what we're talking about. When we're standing here along this roadside, the people are thinking of the Maccabees. They're thinking of Judas the Hammer, who came in and drove out the Seleucid Empire with guerrilla warfare, who was able to create a new kingdom, who had a throne, who had a palace, who became king once again. That's what the people are looking for. It's not some pipe dream of maybe if we can just fit all these prophecies together and figure out all this stuff that's frankly pretty confusing and almost impossible to interpret correctly. We're talking what just happened a couple of generations ago. I mean, Grandpa probably told you stories about living in this kingdom when he was a little kid. This is fresh on the minds of the people as Jesus rides his way to the capital. What if we were able to do it again? What if we rallied together again? What if we fought for our freedom and our country once more, just like our great-grandparents did? We can do this. These are the things that are running around in their heads. And that's why when you read in the Gospel of Mark in chapter 10, as Jesus and his apostles are making their way towards Jerusalem, these conversations are going on because they're thinking about the Maccabees. They're thinking about the hammer. Maybe Jesus is this new hammer. Man, we've seen him do all kinds of crazy stuff. We could do this again. No joke, James, John, oh my gosh, can you even imagine? In fact, in Mark chapter 10, I'm going to read to you this little exchange that Jesus has with his guys, because this is what's on their minds as they're approaching Jerusalem. Let me read it for you. We're going to start in Mark chapter 10, verse 32. They were now on the way to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. The disciples were filled with awe, and the people following behind were overwhelmed with fear. Taking the 12 disciples aside, Jesus once more began to describe everything that was about to happen to him. This is Jesus saying, hey, look, I know what's on your mind, but let me tell you what's actually about to happen. Here's what he says. Listen, he said, we're going up to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be betrayed to the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. They'll sentence him to die and hand him over to the Romans. They'll mock him, spit on him, flog him with a whip, and kill him. But after 3 days, he'll rise again. Then James and John, sons of Zebedee, came over and spoke to him, as if they hadn't been listening to anything that Jesus had just said. Teacher, they said, we want you to do us a favor. Okay, what's your request? Jesus responds. And they reply, when you sit on your glorious throne, we want to sit in places of honor next to you, one on your right and one on your left. Like, have you not been paying attention, you guys? Did you not hear what I just said? But Jesus said to them, you don't know what you're asking. Are you able to drink from the bitter cup of suffering I'm about to drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism of suffering that I must be baptized with? Oh, yeah, they replied. Yeah, we're able. Of course, yeah, no big deal. They have no idea. Absolutely no clue. Then Jesus told them, you will indeed drink from my bitter cup and be baptized with my baptism of suffering. But I have no right to say who will sit on my right or my left. God has prepared those places for the ones that he's chosen. When the other 10 disciples heard what James and John had asked, they were indignant. James and John, they kind of pulled Jesus aside and they're like, hey, Jesus, I know we're getting close to Jerusalem. We know what's about to happen, right? This is going to be great. Hey, we want to be the guys, right? Right and left. Like, we want to be your number one guys. The other 10 disciples hear this conversation going on. They're like, hey, whoa. You guys are jumping the gun. We haven't even entered the gates yet, and you're trying to vie for these positions of power and authority. Come on, man. What are you talking about? Matthew, man, when we picked you up, you were collecting taxes for the Romans. You're not getting a place of honor. Get it. Oh, James, come on. You guys start bickering back and forth, right? So Jesus calls them together and said, you know that the rulers in this world lord it over their people, and the officials flaunt their authority over those among them. And the guys are probably like, yeah, that's kind of the point of being in power, right? I mean, that's one of the benefits. We get to be empowered. Verse 43. But among you, it'll be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be the first among you must be the slave of everyone else. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom for many. This kingdom that Jesus was walking towards, that he was about to set up, looked nothing like this kingdom that the other disciples had playing in their minds. All of those stories of when they were boys running around in the streets with swords, I get to be Judas, I get to be Simon, I'm going to be Jonathan, right? We're going to get these Romans out of here, we're going to be the new... This is the dichotomy between what Jesus was setting up as this new kingdom of God versus this kingdom that everybody else in Israel was anticipating the Messiah to bring about. And Jesus does his best to try and explain to these guys, listen, you don't really understand what's about to happen. I'm setting up this upside down kingdom. I'm going to die for you. I'm going to be suffering from you. Do you have any idea what's about to take place? And they really didn't. They had no idea. They were thinking a traditional kingdom, just like the Assyrians had set up, just like the Babylonians had set up, just like the Persians, just like the Seleucid Empire, just like the Romans. Jesus was doing something so radically different. They couldn't comprehend it. It didn't make sense in their mind. But for Jesus, and for Jesus' followers, that's you and I, our kingdom and our king are completely opposite of what we see around us in the world. It's not a king who is served by the people. It's a king who serves the people. It's a king who walks out and sacrifices his life for the least of these. The least of these. I don't know about you, but I don't see that very often in the world from our leaders. It is a rare thing when our leaders stumble upon service, let alone give their lives for it. But that's what we're called to do. That's the example that we are called to exemplify. Giving our lives sacrificially for the betterment of all creation. All creation. This is the king that we serve as Christians. This is the kingdom that we have given our allegiance to above all others. Our primary role as followers of Jesus is to be ambassadors of that kingdom. Not the kingdom of Rome, not the kingdom of Alexander the Great, but this upside down kingdom of God, where we serve and we love, just like Jesus loved and served us. This is the life that we're called to. May we faithfully serve that king and that kingdom this week as we walk into whatever the future has for us. May you be a light in the world that you find yourself in right now.